it gives me a real pleasure. I truly feel honored. A few years ago, we started this Rana lecture series for social justice, and to touch on topics which are little outliers. Stigma itself is an outlier, but within stigma also there are some identities that we don't talk about as stigmatized. So today, I feel very honored, but I would like my dear friend Yasmin Kanan introduce her to you. Yasmin is interim chair of Department of Microbiology at Harvard, and I'll let her tell you about herself too. Thank you, Yasmin. You can say a few sentences about yourself.
Yes.
Speak a little loud.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Do you hear me? Morning. Thank you for being here today. My name is Yasmin Kanan, and I'm an associate professor of microbiology and interim chair of microbiology department at Howard University College of Medicine. First, let me tell you something about me. My parents, they are Palestinian. Thank you. Free Palestine. Thank you. In 1948, before that, in 1917, if any of you know the history, Palestine was colonized by the British. And in 1948, they decided to give Palestine to the Jews. And then in 1948, under bombing, my parents seek safety, and they locked their homes, like many other families. And this is the key of my family, the home to my family. Like many other families, they locked their homes. They thought it's few days, and they will return. They didn't know it will be so far 76 years until today, no return to home. I have the deeds for the home, for the lands, but unfortunately, because it's very delicate, I couldn't bring it to you. I'll tell you a short story. I know it's about Mrs. Layla, but we agree I'll give you a snap about my life. My parents in 1948, the Nakba, under bombing. You know, Palestine was colonized by British, so they don't have any weapon to defend themselves. In 1948, under bombing, my parents ran away, seeking safety for the sake of the children. My mom, she was pregnant, 9 months. She was carrying 2-year-old baby, and she had 6 years old, 8 years old children. Holding her, imagine the picture, from her dresses. During running, my father and my uncle, they used to help families, help them carrying their children to seek a safe place. During that time, my mom gave birth to a girl, baby girl. That baby girl, my mom, she wrapped her, she carried her. In the other hand, carrying 2 years old, 2 children holding her from both sides. And during that journey, my mom started bleeding. She didn't know what to do. She wrapped that girl, and she put her beside the spring. She talked to herself. She said, whom I sacrifice, the 2 years old, the 6 years old, or the 8 years old? Whom to sacrifice? The newborn for the sake of the rest. She held that baby, put her at the spring. She kept moving, kept bleeding. My father met her. He said, what happened? Where is the baby? She said, I don't know what to do. I'm bleeding. I'm carrying 2 years old, 2 children. What to do? I put her at that spring. My father went, brought her back to her. Then she kept moving. And then, again, she couldn't. She lost energy. So she wrapped the baby and put her at specific spot. My uncle met her, said, what happened? Where is the baby? She said, I left her at that corner. He brought her to her and said, don't leave her again. So my mom held tight to her, to herself, and she lost the other 2 children. till they reach the safety line in Lebanon, because each Palestinian, depend where is their location, closer country to them, they seek that place. And my parents to Lebanon. So I born and raised in Lebanon in a refugee camp called Tal al-Zatar, which is wiped. Today, you'll not find it in the map. And during that war, and during the Tal al-Zatar, in Tal al-Zatar, I raised till middle school. I received my education in United Nations UNRWA schools, mainly for the refugee Palestinian. And then during that war, I'm wiping out that camp. My family moved to the city to the south of Lebanon. And there, I finished my high school in private school and then came to USA. Now you're talking about stigma. When I applied for my visa to come to USA, I applied 3 times. I have been rejected. Why? Because Palestine, it means equal terrorist. 3 times I have been rejected. And then the consulate, he said, come, bring everything to prove that you are going to study. I carried my master's degree. The newspaper talked about my research. I went there, and he asked me a few questions. And at the end, he said, where are you going? I said, to Howard University. He said, but you know, it's a black institution. So this is another stigma. I said, what difference does it make? And when I said that statement, he stamped my passport, and he said, good luck. So I want to talk to you, and not take long. So I want to introduce to you, and by the way, the 1948, they sought safety, and that's why in Gaza now, when they told them leave, seek safe place, go to neighborhood countries, and when things solved, you'll come back. They learned a lesson from the Nakba 1948, and they knew there will be no return. So they hold on ground and said, we are not going anywhere. It was a lesson, and history is repeating itself. So today, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Mrs. Leila Al-Haddad. She's a Palestinian author and a public speaker, and a leading voice on Gaza, a graduate of Harvard's Kennedy School and Duke University. She is the co-author of The Gaza Kitchen, a Palestinian culinary journey, which celebrates Gaza's rich culinary heritage, while highlighting its struggles under Israeli occupation. She has appeared on multiple media outlets, and her writing in leading publications and offers powerful insights into Palestinian culture, history, and resistance. Through her work as journalist, storyteller, and documentation, she provides much-needed insight into the human experience of the region. Most recently, she was a plaintiff in the lawsuit against President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin for their complicity in Israel's unfolding genocides against her family and the 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza. She resides in Maryland with her husband and their 4 children. And by the way, my sister, whom my mom left her twice, she's the one who held up the family. And all of us will grow up because of her. And I'm standing here in front of you because of her. She's the one who was the foundation for the whole family to grow and be successful. So please join me in welcoming Mrs. Al-Haddad.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like I have nothing else to add after that incredible introduction. Thank you, which is a beautiful segue into what I'm going to be speaking about. I'm just waiting for whoever's in charge of the IT to. Do you have a remote I could use by chance or no? No, okay. while they do that, I just want to take a moment to say how honored I am to be addressing you all, to be invited here by Dr. Rana. I don't know where he is. He's such an incredible ball of energy and inspires me. And when he first asked me to come and speak here, at first I was like struggling. I said to him, "Are you sure? How do I, this is the right place for me to be addressing a topic like this, which is obviously very near and dear to my heart?" And he said, "No, it totally is." And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. It's just all the connections are there in front of us. But so often we're led to believe that, this is not the thing you should be talking about, and this is not a cause you should be advocating for, and there is no, stigma involved in this, and this is not something that concerns you, and on and on. I'm sure all this sounds very familiar. And because of all that, I said, I'm going to take this as a challenge, and I want to do this. And sorry, just give me 1 second to open this up in front of myself. Okay. Just multitasking here. All right. Bismillah. Okay. So I'm going to start at the beginning. I'm going to try to cover a lot in a very short amount of time. I'm going to give you a segue from what Dr. Yasmin talked about, the Nakba, and I'm going to get a little bit more into detail into the current situation, what's happening in Gaza, a little bit of history, what's behind the numbers, an overview of how genocide and dehumanization are related to all of this, and of course ending with a little bit of action, what we can do. So Gaza, you could go to the next slide. Oh, who am I pointing to? Okay. Yeah. Gaza is where I call home. This is a picture of Gaza City, where I lived. It's where my parents were born and married, and you could go to the next slide, where I spent much of my childhood and where I raised my young son for the first few years of his life, and where I have many fond memories. To me, Gaza has always been synonymous with love and life and laughter, and the most delicious strawberries on earth that my grandfather would save for me on our visits back in December. The hottest chilies, the warmest people, and the most indomitable spirits. All things, I think, that are not what people think about when they think of Gaza. You could go to the next slide. Instead, I think it's the place where most people are vaguely familiar, the way one might be familiar with Baltimore. Now, I live near Baltimore, so I feel like I can say this. For me, Baltimore feels like a second home, because it does remind me of Gaza in some ways. It gets a bad rep, but Google Gaza. You can go to the next slide. Google Gaza. If you put Gaza in Google, these are the images that you get. In the minds of most, Gaza has been reduced to a series of the worst kinds of stereotypes and caricatures. It is a place, not unlike Baltimore, teeming in the minds of people with violence and poverty. It is ambiguous and unfamiliar and scary, at once both victim and aggressor. And for over 400 days now, it has been enduring what has arguably been the most well-documented and well-funded genocide in recent history. The fastest-paced starvation and deliberate destruction of a society, live-streamed for all of the world to witness. It has been blockaded, besieged, bombarded relentlessly, with no way in and no way out, deliberately silenced in a ruthless campaign to exterminate not only those who are trying to document it, the journalists, but the people themselves. Now, how and why this has been allowed to happen before our very eyes for more than a year, despite all of what I just told you, despite the documentation, despite the fact that we are virtually witnessing this, with the unflagging support of our government, and that's, I think, the crucial component here, is the question that I want to answer today. So first, I want to offer some background, because of course, acts of genocide don't happen overnight. And understanding history is the key to understanding the moment that we're in today. Modern-day Gaza, as you can see here, is a small strip of land occupied by Israel for decades, bordering the Mediterranean and Egypt, just twice the size of Washington, D.C., with 3 times the population. It is home to more than over 2.2 million Palestinians, fathers and sons, daughters, dreamers, and innovators, people who just want to live. The majority of these Palestinians, you could go to the next slide. The majority of these Palestinians are refugees, just like Dr. Yasmin was explaining earlier, and their descendants, survivors of the events that Palestinians refer to as the Nakba in 1948, the violent expulsion from their ancestral towns and villages in the area once known as the Gaza district. You can go to the next slide. So before it was known as the Gaza Strip, it was a much broader area known as the Gaza district. In the modern day vernacular, you might have heard it being referred to as the Gaza envelope. And it was depopulated of the Palestinians who lived there. Many sought refuge in the closest area to them, which was Gaza, and what were supposed to be temporary borders were drawn around them, and they were prevented from returning to their homes. Now, they have been fighting for their basic freedoms and their rights ever since, to return to their homes, to farm, to fish, to simply move freely in and out, to marry other Palestinians who are not in Gaza. They don't have that right. They won't be given the same permits, to organize, to worship freely. But they, along with their brethren elsewhere in Palestine, in occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, have always been met with brutal repression. You can go to the next slide. I can't even actually see what slide I'm on, so I might have to use just give me a second here. Yeah, I'm going to open it up in front of me so I have bad eyesight. Okay, I see it here. So you could see here, these are the original, just to give you a sense, original villages and towns from which Palestinians sought refuge and were forcibly expelled. So you could go to the next slide. Over the past few decades, Palestinians have been subject, as you can see here, to an oppressive Israeli military occupation that is intended to keep them controlled and contained, ghettoized, if you will, in order to maintain an ethno-supremacist state, one that, in the words of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, this is, quote, for the Jewish people and the Jewish people only, despite the over 50% of the population in its entirety, in the entirety of the land, who are actually Palestinian. Now, of course, this is in keeping with the foundations, with the Zionist foundations and the tenets of the State of Israel. You could go to the next slide. Now, these Palestinians have been separated from one another through a complex system of walls and fences, barriers, and over 500 checkpoints, along with a color-coded permit and road system. Everything about their lives is controlled by Israel. Now, I'm going to have to, that's the subject of another long talk that I can give, just talking about the apartheid system of Israel. But I just wanted to kind of give you an overview, if you will, sort of the theme that colors everything that is happening today. The genocide in Gaza, you could go to the next slide, can be understood in this context that I just talked about. It is an extension of a decades-long policy. In the words of, I don't know if any of you saw this wonderful interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, but he calls it a genocide in the service of apartheid. What's happening in Gaza, a genocide in the service of this decades-long Israeli apartheid. And as you can see here, everything that is happening in Gaza, this euphemism the Israelis use of mowing the lawn in Gaza, kind of thinning the population and keeping things in check there, is really about suppressing Palestinian rights and freedoms, maintaining this system of violent Israeli apartheid and control, and leaving Palestinians with this false choice: resist and be killed, leave voluntarily or by force, or stay here and accept a status quo with us in charge, with you as unequals. This is the choice that Palestinians are left with. You could go to the next slide. Now, for a variety of reasons, Gaza has bore the brunt of this Israeli aggression. Again, long list of reasons that I can get into later, but it always seems to be kind of a haven of resistance. Every great revolutionary of our time over the past century has understood this principle. From Che Guevara to Malcolm X to Nelson Mandela, all of whom visited Gaza at one point. And that's actually a picture of my grandfather next to Che Guevara there on the left. All of them visited Gaza. Many people don't know this, as early as the 1950s. And they understood that what is happening to Gaza is the key to understanding not only what is happening in the rest of Palestine, but the key to understanding what is happening to oppressed peoples everywhere. And as Nelson Mandela famously said, we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. I had another great picture, but I think it was in an older version of this presentation where one of my friends who was a poet and professor who was killed last year in Gaza was participating in what was known as the Great March of Return at the Border, and he was holding up a sign with a quote by Malcolm X that said, if you want something, you'd better make some noise. And just for him, he was very passionate about that, and he understood innately the natural link that existed there. You could go to the next slide. Sadly, the Palestinians in Gaza have suffered multiple assaults in a punishing blockade for over 17 years, so this isn't something new. And it has culminated in the events of the past year. You could keep going. The statistics are sobering. Even though that's not what I want to focus on, they still bear covering just for a little bit. Over 10% of the entire population of Gaza over the course of the past year and some have either been killed, injured, or rendered missing under the rubble. The majority of these 70% are women and children. It has also been deadly for aid workers, both in the healthcare sector and journalists. This genocide has seen more health workers, more aid workers, and more journalists killed than anything else in recent memory. Everything that sustains life has been the subject of a deliberate and systematic campaign of destruction. All of the universities have been completely or partially destroyed. All of the schools, all of the places of worship, both churches and mosques. Very critically, the National Archive was destroyed on the second day of Israel's attacks. All of the historic and cultural centers of Gaza City, and even the farms in what many have called act of ecocide, have been destroyed. In fact, a very close friend of mine who was a farmer trying to save seeds and feed the north of Gaza, who was bearing the brunt of all of this policy of starvation, was killed as he was delivering vegetables to his neighbors a couple of weeks ago. The entire population of Gaza has been displaced, and food has been wielded as a weapon of war, with an ongoing effort to starve the north of Gaza into submission, where no aid has been allowed for more than 2 months, to sow chaos and lawlessness there and attempt to pacify the population. You could keep going. And really, I wish I had a whole hour, but I know that I'm short on time, so I'm kind of rushing through this. Behind each of these numbers, of course, is a story, a student, a dream, a karate champion, a poet, an engineer, and I wish I had time to spend just an entire hour talking about each of these stories, and maybe I'll come back and do that some other time, because really I think that's the core, the key to all of this. The scale of the violence and the disproportionate use of force against a stateless civilian population and the lack of accountability and international response have all rendered the situation in Gaza particularly unique. The double standards are glaring, and if anything, what has happened in Gaza has exposed all of this. But so has the vast amount of financial backing that Israel has received from our government, a whopping $17.9 billion since last year alone. Now, I'm just going to put that in perspective. That is the equivalent of funding 300,000 teachers' salaries in the United States, offsetting 600,000 student loans, and building 100,000 new affordable housing units here in the DC area. I was just talking to my taxi driver on the way here and was telling me how they can no longer afford even to live in the area that used to be affordable for Ethiopian immigrants because of the skyrocketing prices. And I mentioned this figure to him, $18 billion, just 12 months. He was astounded. To do what? To sustain, to enable, and to abet a genocide. So how has Israel been able to manufacture consent? I'm going to kind of move on now. We've heard the figures and statistics. How were they able to manufacture consent to perpetuate a massacre of this proportion so deliberately, so brazenly, so sort of in your face, telling us exactly what they're going to do, and then go ahead and do it, and then keep doing it for so long with the absolute and unwavering diplomatic, military, and financial backing of the United States? Why in the modern day, in the era of never again, despite being told exactly what it is they intended to do, and irrespective of the facts at hand, has this been allowed to happen and to continue? There's another element at play here, and kind of, bringing it all together. Dehumanization, more specifically, systematic dehumanization. The process of stripping individuals or groups of their humanity, of their positive human qualities, making it easier, of course, to justify violence against them. It is a tool that has been used for centuries in the service of colonialism, domination, enslavement, and of course, genocide, without which what we are witnessing today could not have been possible. I'm going to explain a little bit. Mechanisms such as the use of false narrative, misleading terminology, or euphemisms in propaganda. Of course, the role of the media, all of this plays a big role in shaping the public discourse and setting the stage for, of course, the horrific acts of genocide. But before I get into all that, I want to provide a brief overview of what constitutes genocide exactly and the limits of the law, because even though I'm not a lawyer, there's been a lot of misunderstanding about this that has been used, that has been weaponized against Palestinians. Contrary to what many have heard or believe, what is happening in Gaza is not a conflict. You'll see this a lot, right? Everywhere you go, on the airwaves, on the whatever, any more than apartheid or the Jim Crow South were conflicts. But as an ongoing genocidal campaign driven by systematic violence, displacement, and the destruction of the Palestinian people's ability to not only survive, but thrive, in which one group exercises control and domination and violence over the other, leading to widespread oppression and dehumanization. Now, what is genocide exactly, and what is its impact? Most people, I think, when they think of genocide, what they immediately think of is that it is an act that involves the mass killing of people, like it's defined by the numbers or the quantities. And unfortunately, misunderstanding, misinformation, and disinformation, as I'm going to get into, and the absence of the historical context, all of this can severely impact the affected groups. You could keep going. Now, of course, because people don't want to dilute it of its meaning, it is not something that is leveled lightly, right? So it makes sense. Accusations of genocide against Israel were first actually made by the country of South Africa in the International Court of Justice back in January. Many of you might know this, in addition to here in the United States by myself and other plaintiffs in a federal court. So that happened on the same day, actually. And it seems shocking to many. Many people, of course, cast even doubt on the whole idea of using the law to this end. Like, what's the point? What will this matter? But a year ago, nobody was using the word Israel and genocide in one sentence. They didn't think that was something that we should do. They didn't think it was something that was even happening. Now it seems to be that there was a change in the discourse, and it's partly because of this. So it's not always necessarily about, being guided by the end result. It's about putting in the actions and the work, not guaranteeing the result. Now, those accusations seem shocking to many. And here I'm going to quote journalist Masha Geeson in The New Yorker, in which she said, Israel, the state which was born in the aftermath of the carnage that gave the world the word genocide, and the Genocide Convention unanimously adopted the United Nations in 1948, is now itself committing genocide. Now, a lot of it has to do with common misconceptions, as I said, about what genocide is exactly. People tend to think of it as the slaughter of a people in large numbers. And as I said earlier, quantity doesn't figure into this at all. Unfortunately, like with most modern-day systems and institutions, the term is often applied selectively. Now, it was Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin who coined the term in 1944, defining it as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, right? Not destroy all of the group, not just necessarily want in whole or in part. And it can involve acts such as killing certain members of the group, causing bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. Sounds familiar, right? Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group. The crime of genocide has two elements: intention and execution. Now, execution has been, proven pretty well through the media, through the images, and so on and so forth. The more difficult part has been to prove intent, the language of genocide, as it were. You could go to the next slide. Now, the irony is that Israeli leaders themselves laid out exactly what it is they intended to do very early on, coupling that with dehumanizing language and imagery that built on decades of demonizing Palestinians. Remember, this didn't start overnight. A database of more than 500 statements by Israeli soldiers and leaders, and this is actually just in the past 12 months, not dating back. I'm just giving you examples of the long history of demonizing Palestinians here. 500 statements showing Israeli incitement to genocide and providing ample evidence of their intent to genocide. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant described Palestinians precisely in this way as, quote, human animals more than 12 months ago in his proclamation of a total siege on October the 9th. The Israeli Prime Minister, in that same speech, in which he promised to block Gaza from all of life's necessities, the consequences of which we are seeing today in northern Gaza. Netanyahu described Gaza as a, quote, city of evil, and then on December the 24th, framed Israel's attack as a fight against monsters. This is a battle, he said, not only of Israel against barbarians, but it is a battle of civilization against barbarism, he said. Netanyahu implied that the total destruction of the Palestinians was necessary by describing them as people of darkness, the biblical people of Amalek, and as Nazis. Israeli President Herzog then claimed this was an effort to save Western civilization from an empire of evil. Now, uninformed readers and listeners and observers might go, oh my gosh, that's really bad. You know, they're horrible. That's the impact of all this dehumanizing language, right? And it was no coincidence that all of this happened at the very outset, coupled with a campaign of disinformation and propaganda, attributing gruesome, almost unthinkable, almost absurd acts to the Palestinians that never actually took place. We've all heard of the 40 beheaded babies story, I'm sure. Many of which were parroted and echoed at the highest levels of power and influence here in the United States, including by President Biden, who went so far as to cast doubt on the number of Palestinians who had been killed when asked by a reporter, saying that Palestinians were not reliable as human beings, as individuals, and therefore what they say shouldn't be taken as at face value. We saw this too in the media, with the media parroting the 40 beheaded baby story, with quoting any figures of Palestinian deaths as questionable, as something emerging from Palestinians who themselves are not trustworthy individuals. By the time people were actually clued in, and I like to think at some point they were, it was too late, as it often is, which is why people were warning about this very early on. As I said, genocide doesn't happen overnight, and this wouldn't have been possible. You could actually move forward a little bit. I completely forgot about the... Oh, who's in charge of the... Can you forward the slides a bit? Yeah, so these are just some more examples, things that I had referenced earlier when I was talking about the different kinds of statements that Israeli leaders have made. These were ones that were made over the past decades, promising to turn Gaza into an island of ruin, hoping that it would disappear. You could go one ahead. These are different Israeli leaders and officials, again, using the demonizing language of Palestinians, referring to them as cockroaches, and other instances as crocodiles, as with an insatiable appetite, as beasts, as unhumans. One more, and then these are more recent statements that I referred to, showing the specific intent to genocide. In the words of Netanyahu, to, quote, make Gaza unlivable. One more, please. And this was from last year when the defense and the prime ministers talked about fighting human animals and so on. So as I said, this wouldn't have been possible without decades of demonization, not only of Palestinians, but of Arabs and of people of color more broadly, right? As uncivilized, dangerous, barbaric, less human, and therefore dispensable, the unhuman to which the laws of war do not apply, allowing Israel to give itself the moral pretext to do whatever it is they will with the Palestinians, no matter how appalling. And I want to show a brief video here speaking to this culture of demonization. Can you go one forward and play the video? Hoping that there's audio. Shoot, is it not playing? I might just have to go forward. It's not playing? Okay. Well, you could look it up. I guess it's a great video, but it talks about the culture of dehumanizing Palestinians within Israeli society, the absence of the Palestinian in Israeli textbooks, for example, in the discourse. It talks about many of you might have seen the series of TikToks posted by Israeli soldiers, wearing women's lingerie in Gaza, destroying people's homes, making a mockery of the places they were Okay, so I'll just go forward since it's not working. You could go one more. Yep, there you go. The role of the media also cannot be ignored in enabling these Israeli actions. From using the passive voice, Palestinians were killed versus Israeli soldiers killed Palestinians, to casting doubt on Palestinian deaths, which are routinely underreported, statistically speaking, to adopting wholesale the Israeli government's terminology and propaganda as facts. Early on, we always saw any kind of figure talking about Palestinian casualties as coming from the Hamas-run health ministry. Disinformation can be deadly for Palestinians and has very real consequences, as we saw here in the United States. You could go one more. From the shooting to death of the 6-year-old Uda al-Fayoumi to the shooting of 3 young Palestinian college students in Vermont for wearing a Palestinian kufiya, and on and on. Disinformation is literally deadly for Palestinians. Edward Said understood this when he argued that dehumanizing stereotypes, Edward Said, the late Palestinian, of course, scholar, understood that dehumanizing stereotypes of the so-called Orient are in service of colonialism and political oppression, as did Frantz Fanon before him, when he correctly noted that it is a fundamental mechanism used in maintaining colonial power structures. This is because dehumanization is a systematic colonial strategy as old as time itself. We don't have to look back too far for examples. You could go to the next slide. Whether it was the slaughter of millions of Native Americans and critically their way of life in the name of so-called manifest destiny, or the legacy, of course, of slavery and its aftermath, Martin Luther King put it best when he noted, quote, "Our nation was born in genocide, when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shore, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population." End quote. So it should come as no surprise that a country born from genocide, to quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., so staunchly supports the genocide and an unfolding genocide of another. After all, it has been the unwavering support of the Biden administration and their carefully crafted political narrative that gave Israel a carte blanche and a perfect opportunity to finish the job in Gaza, execute the plans they've had all along. Ones on which the founding of their country were based, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Gaza from their ancestral homeland under the guise of self-defense, or at least to so-called, use the Israeli euphemism, thin the population so much to manageable proportions, to push them into ghettos while destroying everything that sustains life there, as I mentioned earlier, hospitals and schools and farms and so on, making Palestinians completely dependent on the hand that starves and kills them. Genocide in the service of apartheid. And yet, despite everything that I have just told you, despite the facts that have been laid out as clear as day, despite the intent to genocide that has been so clearly demonstrated, despite this being a textbook example of genocide and the dehumanization in the service of genocide, it is equally one of the most denied genocides, one to which there appears to be the most resistance, not by people, I would argue, but by the rules-based order and the systems and countries that support it, the post-World War II rules-based order. You could go to the next slide, I'm almost done. Fear-mongering, doxing, and intimidation tactics to punish and deliberately silence those who speak out about this tragedy have become rampant, enshrined in law even. I don't know if any of you were following, but House Bill 9495 just got passed an hour ago, which punishes nonprofits advocating for justice and equality by stripping them of their tax-exempt status. Now, this was designed, again, as an intimidation tactic to try to silence those who are speaking out on behalf of Palestinians or advocating on their behalf. And as you can see here, there's no shortage of headlines talking about not only college students, but I just today received another message about a hospital in California who is now banning any public, demonstration, showing support of Palestinians. So you can't wear pins, you can't do anything, you can't, right? So trying again to stigmatize speaking out on behalf or advocating on behalf of Palestinian rights and justice. Now, of course, that makes the power of narrative all the more important, which is what I devote most of my work to. But I want to end on a hopeful note because I know that I probably have surpassed my time. And you could go to the next slide. I had another great slide here, but unfortunately it didn't make it into the, it talks about, you know, what anti-Palestinian racism looks like. But I just wanted to end on a hopeful note. Actually, can you go to the last one more slide and then back to this one? I just want to talk about this gentleman here, and then I'm going to go to my last slide. So, you know, I often get asked, like, God, but how do you keep going? Or this, or, you know, don't you despair? Or this, you know, what's the point of it all? Or, and I always think back to this gentleman. He's a farmer who I met in Gaza a few years ago. And I stopped to chat with him, and I asked what he was doing. And he was planting a young olive sapling on his farm. Now, he told me his farm had been completely destroyed, uprooted by Israeli armored bulldozers funded by the United States 3 separate times. 3 separate times. Now, any logical person would conclude that this is an act of insanity. Why does he keep replanting his farm knowing that the armored bulldozers will come back and destroy it again? And for anyone who doesn't know, it takes olive trees, you know, almost 10 years to become fruitful and productive. So he will be without an income or livelihood for 10 years. And his response was, you know, I have no other choice. This is my personal way of resisting. And if I don't do this, then I've given up. And I don't guarantee the results, but I have to put in the effort and the work. That's my obligation, that's my sacred duty. And so I always like to center conversations relating to, but what can we do, by remembering this young farmer here. You could back up one. And finally, just ending on this note, you know, to me, to use the language of, you know, since this is a conference on stigma, pathways to prevention, the best way to do that, for me personally, is to educate yourself, educate others in your circles, you know, find reliable news sources. These are some of the ones that I think are the best. The Institute for Middle East Understanding is a great one. Al Jazeera Labs and Al Jazeera Plus. Visualizing Palestine is a resource for infographics, and We Are Not Numbers is a depot of Palestinian narratives. So Palestinians writing their own stories, especially young Palestinians. It's fantastic. For those of you who you know, are more hands-on, there is no shortage of ways to get involved, to organize, to disrupt. A lot of that is going on around DC, and even, you know, all politics is local around your local councils. And then, of course, finally, to advocate, whether that's lobbying your representatives or getting involved in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, attending teach-ins and workshops. There is nothing too small. I always like to quote, there's a tradition, Islamic tradition saying that says, the most beloved deeds are those that are the most consistent, even if they are small. Thank you so much for being a wonderful listening audience.
Thank you, Dr. Leila, for really emotional message. And allow me, I know we are behind the time, just allow me 1 minute, please. The farmers, the last slide, farmers, how many of you heard that Palestinians sold their land? How many of you? Grandparents told me in any occasion, you have a chance to deliver this message so the truth will not die. He said, we are farmers in Palestine. We cultivate at the end of season, we harvest the crops, we put it in market for sale. Neighborhood countries, they come to buy our crops. Britain, what does it do? It costs us, like per pound, example, like 50 cents. They bring crops from outside and they put it in market for 25 cents. They end selling their crops with loss. So they don't have money to invest, to buy the seeds, to rent the equipment in order for next season. So the banks, Britain, comes to the farmers and say, okay, I'll give you a loan, but give me a collateral. How guarantee that you will pay me back? The farmers, all what they have is the deed for their land. So they give them the deed. And next day, they do the same game. And the farmers end losing the land, and Britain own the deed of these lands. So I have been told by these grandparents, all our seniors said, when you have a chance to tell the story, the truth, so it will not die, we didn't sell our land as they told. It's true, some they sold. They are in need. They have no other way to survive. But this is how they have the deeds. So the key I have is through Dr. Rana. The doll was precious, and that family would not sold it with a mountain of gold. But this key, I would not sold it with the whole world. And my message to Stigma, and I'll end my message, I always tell my students, when we born, no one asks you your color, your religion, your gender, whom you want to born to, which country, your religion. We born naive. And we are here, so let us do the best out of it. And thank you for listening. Thank you.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you. I don't know if any of you know what this is about. I know some of you know, but this is about resistance to genocide. This is what it means. This stands for Gaza resisting genocide. And they are not going to give their land, and there will be a free Palestine, God willing, soon.